when I moved to the Co-op, not long, about a year after I moved there, it transpired that London was going to bid for the Olympics. And I mean, I had no idea what that meant. And I didn't really have a strong opinion about it. I mean, I imagined that if London won the Olympics, I knew that our place would be demolished and evicted, but I thought people would be really well looked after. After all, you know, Britain is a developed country.
It's really important that, you know, that all of their needs are met, and if there are communities, they should be given the chance to move away as a community to somewhere comparable. And that doesn't mean, you know, a good distance away. It means as close to where they were. I appreciate the difficulty of these issues of relocation, but I'm not convinced that they were really, you know, carried out, you know, in the best and most satisfactory way for the residents. In fact, I'm sure they weren't.
It breaks up your community. So Clays Lane was a very sociable community, and when you're forced to move, you know, it's much harder to stay in touch with people.
Let's bear in mind that this was a 4-week event, if you include the Olympics and the Paralympics. A 4-week event where many hundreds, thousands of people are actually being impacted for a lifetime by having their home taken away or not being able to stay where they were staying. I don't think that's fair at all. And again, I think it shows the mismatch between the local residential needs and priorities versus a national juggernaut, or even a global entity, which can run roughshod over it. Because let's face it, people watching the Olympics on TV aren't thinking about the couple of hundred people in the local area who might have been asked to move on because they or their accommodation didn't fit the Olympic mould.
Yeah, one of the first things that happened, there was an estate of student housing adjacent to the housing cooperative we lived on that housed around 500 students. There were 2 tower blocks and some low-rise housing. And the London Development Agency did a deal with East London University, who owned this estate, to evict and take over the student housing 3 years, or 2 years roughly, before other land was acquired for the Olympics. So basically housing for 500 people in a city that has a desperate shortage of housing was left empty for 2 years.
And on top of that, it meant that the next year's students didn't have anywhere to go, so they had to go onto the private market for that year or two before UEL built its new housing. And in the process, UEL behaved extremely badly. They told people that they had to leave the day that the estate closed. That is, they were sent notices to quit. Actually, this is completely illegal. You have to take people to court if you want to evict them. They said they were going to change the locks, and they weren't allowed to do that. They had to change their minds. But the process was unpleasant, and it just reflects the way in which once a juggernaut has got rolling like this, other people get caught up in it, even if they're peripheral to the event itself.
The people I lived in the housing cooperative with, that's 500 people, were given secure social housing, which is great. But the problem is the housing cooperative was comparatively cheap. The new housing that people have got, for people on minimum wages, it's borderline whether and many people in the housing cooperative who are on minimum wage would actually be able to survive. They did get £8,500 each as well to help them with the move, but that money, you know, be soaked up in about a year and a half of extra rent, 2 years of extra rent. So, you know, it wasn't a great deal. I was there for about a year and a half immediately before the Olympics, so I wasn't on a tenancy. So I wasn't on the list of people to be rehoused officially. So I bought a tiny little boat, which we're now sitting next to, and where I live, you know, there's a lovely community of people living a slightly alternative lifestyle in London, very unusual lifestyle in London.
And the LDA itself said we would get housing which would be either as good as or better than what we had. But in the end, they just gave us whatever they had. I mean, I've lived in two houses since both houses have had damp in them. I didn't have damp in either of my houses at Clays Lane, so because I lived in two different places at Clays Lane. So, I mean, the quality of housing has not been of the same standard in that sense. But in other respects, I mean, you know, where I'm living now is quite pleasant. I don't have any complaints about it. But I didn't want to move, so I was quite happy staying where I was.
Then I realised that they were essentially lying about the amount of housing the London Olympics was going to provide. A very simple fact was that they didn't subtract the housing they were demolishing and the housing that was going to be provided by the Stratford City development that was happening anyway, regardless of the Olympics, from the figure of housing they were supposedly providing. So there was a difference of many thousands of houses, of homes. I mean, it's misinformation looking at it in a benevolent way. It's a lie looking at it in a less benevolent way.
The Athletes' Village itself is being converted for use, but the Athletes' Village is being built, as I said, on Clays Lane, on Stratford City. So that housing was going to be built as part of a separate project, so that is not a housing legacy. And if you walk up and down Stratford High Street and you look over in the distance, you'll see all sorts of blocks of flats have been built all over this area. So that housing was going to be built even if the Olympics didn't come. So this area was going to be developed. I mean, this whole piece of land here is incredibly valuable. And you've got rivers and canals running through it, which is where housing developers like to build housing. So if you look at the blocks of flats that are being built here, you'll see that a lot of them are being built next door to the canals and rivers. These canals and rivers run all the way through the park. So those sites were going to be built on with housing. So it's very possible that more housing would have been built on the Olympic Park if the Olympics hadn't happened, because this site's now got a lot of stadiums on it. And those stadiums, obviously you can't build where those stadiums are. The sites where the stadiums, all around the stadiums, will be used for housing, but not as much housing as would have been built otherwise.